Trilogies. Is there no greater word in cinema that fills you with both dread and joy? There are many great trilogies out there. However, when it comes down to it, there are only two real kind of trilogies. We have the planned trilogies, like Lord of the Rings, and we have the unplanned trilogies, like the Matrix trilogy. Oftentimes, trilogies aren't planned so much as the first movie made a lot of money, let's declare we're making two more, make this a fun little trilogy. Now, some trilogies can change as they develop over time. The Back to the Future trilogy changed as it developed. The original Star Wars trilogy changed as the series developed. However, most of the time, something is forced into that format in order to sell more tickets and to make the product seem like it has some sort of bigger meaning than the first movie probably intended. Interestingly enough, some of the best trilogies have no planning involved, they're just separate adventures of a character. The Indiana Jones trilogy, the Die Hard trilogy, and the Mummy trilogy. It's an odd one to pull. You can't force a story. It just doesn't feel right. And when you do try to force a story, it doesn't quite work the way you want it to work. Because sometimes you don't need a sequel, and most times you definitely don't need two sequels. And while movies having sequel after sequel after sequel is a completely different discussion, ones that have ended in 3 movies tend to find themselves struggling to find a way to make the story really work. That being said, just because you plan a trilogy doesn't mean it comes out great. The Star Wars prequels are a fine example of that. Or the Hobbit trilogy, or any number of other planned but not particularly well executed trilogies that exist. Today, I'm looking at Fear Street Part 3, 1666, the final part of this trilogy that sadly fumbles the ball and soured me a little bit on this entire saga. I won't say it's gonna suck, but, well, you know. Okay, so much like with Part 2, Part 3 will open up a little bit of spoilers because it's a direct continuation. We start up exactly where we left off in Part 2, with Dina seemingly appearing in 1666. However, this is clearly shown to not be the case. Instead, we are just seeing what occurred in 1666, with all the parts being played by actors from the first 2 movies. It's kind of clever, because it gives you some shorthand on who these people are and how they behave, but it can also be a little distracting, as this oftentimes is when movie studios do these kinds of things. Our story takes place in the township of Union. We follow Sarah Fear and some of the other kids as they're planning a crazy rager because of the full moon. At this party, people are getting a little wasted on looks to be apple wine. Some of them are eating the strange berries provided to them by the widow in the woods. They're getting high, they're getting drunk, they're basically breaking every rule that the Puritans would hold sacred. And you know what? It kind of makes sense. They are teenagers, and when you try to force people to behave a certain way, they're going to have to let loose every once in a while. And it works well to show these various kids behaving in a more normal way. By our current standards, I guess. Although, if you're in the woods and you're drinking alcohol and doing drugs, don't be surprised if a man with a hockey mask comes out of nowhere and starts cutting you guys down. Just saying. After the party is over, things start to go bad in the town. Dead animals, rotting crops, strange weather, the usual kind of cursed land things. This leads to a search for a scapegoat. And unfortunately, people know about the not well-kept secret that Hannah and Sarah have a kind of lesbian-type relationship going on. And this immediately leads them to being targeted as the witches after someone says that they were seen cavorting with the devil. Because why do you need proof? Just point to someone and say that. Well, obviously Sarah was going to have to be targeted as a witch. I was a little bit bothered by the Sarah-Hannah relationship, and not for the reasons why some people might think. More because Puritans are so strict about this kind of stuff and it feels like their relationship is incredibly not secret at all. It wouldn't be a surprise if one or both of them were stoned to death, exiled, or otherwise shamed for their behavior. And it feels like everyone is kind of okay with it. It's a little weird and doesn't fit in with the time period very well. It would have been nice if it had been a little more secret, or if it just hadn't been a plot point at all, because it really isn't necessary. Anyhow, Sarah and Hannah are targeted as witches. Sarah ends up making an escape to try to figure out what's really going on with the land, as she believes she has nothing to do with it, no matter what kind of sinning she may have committed. In the end, Sarah finds out what the truth is behind the curse on their land. Unfortunately, it happens a little too late. After that, we return to our 90s kids, now completely filled with the knowledge of the past and preparing a methodology to stop the curse once and for all. Anything after that would be a major spoiler, but I will say this, they do have a pretty cool showdown at the mall, which is fitting because the series began at a mall. There isn't a lot I can say about the characters, as most of the characters don't really have much in terms of personality, and we spend the latter half of the movie with characters we've already met. But I'll break things down a little bit, because I think some of these characters are a bit interesting. Sarah Fier plays a very interesting role. Not only is she an older sister, like Dina is, and she seems to do a lot to help take care of the pigs her family is raising. She's very confident and seems to know what she is doing, but unfortunately is also treated a bit like an outsider, probably because she's a female who's spending time working with things that would be traditionally seen as male work. But it doesn't bother her father, and it doesn't bother her brother, and they're living a happy life. We have Hannah, who is Sarah's love interest. She's also the pastor's daughter, and she ends up kind of just being our damsel in distress. Finally, the last major character is Solomon Good. He is the ancestor of the Good family, and seems to have a bit of a relationship with Sarah, also lives a bit outside of town for some reason. That's never really fully explained. He does have a brother who lives in the town, but Solomon has chosen to kind of live apart. It seems that he doesn't really agree with the Puritan way of life, I don't blame him, and functions as a confidant for Sarah, and helps protect her when the mob is coming after her. Most of the other characters at the township of Union are kind of just there for show. While Thomas is interesting being kind of this town drunk, spreading rumors about Sarah, he doesn't really have much play beyond being a jerk. A lot of the other kids have almost no real personalities, and while we do have a pastor who loses his mind and goes on a killing spree, the first of the major killers in what would later be known as Shadyside, we don't get to know the pastor well before he goes and does some killing. The characters are fine, and their sole purpose is to just push the story forward so we can get back to the present and solve the main problems that we are facing, but because of that, a lot of the characters come off a bit shallow. Aesthetically, there's a lot to like about this movie. First off, we have the music. This is one of the few times where you can really enjoy the score. While the score does play a bit in 1978, the first half of this movie really plays up the score due to the fact that there aren't a lot of radio hits from the 1600s. When they get back to the 90s music continues and fits the scenes generally well, and continuing the tradition of the awesome soundtrack that makes up the Fear Street trilogy. Visually, we have some great stuff. The township of Union looks very authentic. It looks very, dirty. It's not been played up to be this overly nice version of history. It looks probably what things looked like in history. The widow's house and Solomon's house, they feel like small enclosed cabins where people who've decided to not be part of the main society have lived for several years now at least. All the locations used in the 1666 portion do look authentic, and that is one of the things they've really tried to do in this movie trilogy, is to have things look like they should look. And they did a great job with the 1600s. It is one of the few things I will never complain about when it comes to the Fear Street trilogy, is the quality of the sets and the quality of the music. Aesthetically, this series has been spot on from the first movie to the last. Here's the part I was dreading. The part where I start ripping into the movie. But first, let me begin with a little nitpick, because this kind of annoyed me when I watched the movie, and it feels like something they could have easily fixed. In part 1, Josh continuously does the Konami code whenever he's starting to get stressed out, whenever he's afraid. It's kind of his way of making himself feel stronger. As they reach the climax of the movie and are preparing for the battle in the mall, Josh tells Dina the code and has her say it, and then explains that the code is used in several games, including Ninja Turtles, Super Contra, and Castlevania. Here's the problem with that. In 1994, there was no Castlevania game that used the Konami code. Also, when brought to the United States, Contra 2 was called Super C, not Super Contra. In addition to that, Super C doesn't even use the Konami code. It uses a different code. It feels kind of weak for them not to take the 2 seconds to go onto Google and type in Konami code to look up what games prior to 1994 used the code for extra lives. Without giving any spoilers away, there are 2 other minor issues I have with this movie. The first is the fact that psychic flashbacks are kind of a lazy storytelling tool in order to get stuff across. It could have been handled in a way wherein it didn't feel like, hey, here's kind of half a movie to fill in a little bit of story. I'm sure most people had no problem with this, but for me it just kind of felt a little lazy considering how much effort they put into everything else. The other issue, of course, is the relationship between Sarah and Hannah that I covered earlier. Not that I have an issue with the relationship, it's just that the Puritans should have been freaking out at those kind of rumors and punishing the girls for their behavior due to the extreme way the Puritans viewed everything. However, my main problems with this movie are very spoiler heavy. If you have not seen this movie yet, you may want to skip this section. If you have seen the movie, prepare to understand why I didn't like it, because this ending is so botched, it made me feel sad. While preparing the battle in the mall, they need Dina's blood because she's the one being targeted. Now, I understand that they're watering down the blood, and they're adding in some phosphorescent chemicals in there so they can, see the blood with the lights off and what have you. But they get a lot of blood out of her. I noticed this in part 1 with Sam, but here is the key difference. After they drained some of Sam's blood and used it to trap the killers, we ended up having Sam sitting there seeming half out of it, very weak, and that makes sense. As someone who donates blood, I can tell you, after you give up a pint of blood, you feel pretty out of it. And they even have you wait some time, eat some food, and recover a bit before you leave the blood drive. However, when Dina gives blood, she's then running around, she's battling the main villain, she's being chased, and being really active, and I'm like, how are you doing that without passing out? I understand that adrenaline can keep someone going a bit, but they've always tried to have a little bit of realism in this movie, and it feels a little unrealistic to be able to fill up multiple water guns with her blood mixture and not have Dina be pushed around in a wheelchair or sitting somewhere going like, okay guys, it's up to you. I need some graham crackers and some juice, please. I understand that that's a bit in the nitpick side of things, but I still stand at it as being a little bit of a problem because it puts a major hole in Dina's action sequence at the end when you realize that she should just be half out of it at this point. Speaking of Dina's chase, she ends up getting into these catacombs under the mall that end up leading her to the Good Family Mansion. What? Why are these tunnels there? I understand the tunnels that are in the forest and the hills and stuff from 1978. Why is there a tunnel that connects the Good Family Mansion to the mall? That makes no sense. Why is that even there? It's almost as if I thought I'd skipped a scene and maybe she was still in the forest or something. I understand if the cave from the forest connects to the mansion, but I do not understand how the mall connects to a cave connects to the mansion. It makes no sense. It is a stupid idea. You have a mall, plenty of cool mall locations for fighting, and you go to a cave. A cave that makes no sense. We also have things wrap up really neatly. We don't lose any of our mains at this point. Sam, Dina, Josh, the one guy they get to help them out, none of them die. They all come out unscathed. Only the bad guy dies, and the revived killers get defeated. But no one on the main team dies, and anyone who does die is like a generic faceless character who shows up for 2 seconds. I'm not saying my horror movie needs to be a swan song. However, having no major scars or trauma after dealing with something like this is ridiculous. In some of the best slasher movies out there, we see the damage done both physically and mentally, as the story concludes. And in this one, they kind of get out of it and are just like, hey, cool, life, that was a weird couple of days, huh? Let's just go on with life as if nothing ever happened. I understand that sometimes R.L. Stine will do that in his books, but it's a really unsatisfying ending in a horror movie. Also, how in the seven hells are none of these people in jail? You gotta understand that, like, when the other cops would have shown up when the battle was over, they would find dead cop bodies, graffiti all over the mall, blood splatter all over the mall. How did they not get arrested for this? How does the news immediately go, oh, such and such was a serial killer and the bad guy the whole time. Now let's all go back to normal life. Well, how would you prove that? You couldn't go to the police and just go, oh, by the way, he was the serial killer. It was that guy. What's your proof? So I have no idea why everything just goes back to normal. It's like, oh, well, I guess he was a serial killer. Moving on. I know they tried to establish the whole que sera sera feeling about serial killers in Shadyside. However, is there any proof that links this man to crime? And I can't think of anything that would do that. So how the hell did they get out of this and just go back to real life afterwards? Even if they left the mall, the bodies there, I think the story on the news would have been something more like, tragedy at the mall last night when 3 police officers went to investigate and ended up dead. No one knows who the killer is, story at 11. Something like that would have worked a lot better. Because, like, okay, they all escaped, and now everyone's like, well, there's these dead cops at the mall, we don't know who did it. And that makes a lot more sense than just blaming the bad guy for being the bad guy, because I guess apparently the reporter was just told, oh, by the way, I had a psychic flashback to the 1600s that told me that this family was evil, so we had to kill them. And the reporter said, yeah, seems legit. Come up with something that's a bit more realistic. Like the cover-up at the end of Part 1 made sense. There should have been some sort of cover-up at the end of Part 3 that would make sense. Sometimes horror movies can be destroyed by their endings making no sense or being really stupid, and there are horror movies I absolutely hate that mostly because of the ending. This is one of them. I don't think this movie is terrible. It has too many good parts. The audio, the visuals, the likable characters. But the story itself falls apart in such a way that it really kind of soured me on the entire trilogy. And it's unfortunate because I really, really liked Fear Street 1 and 2. And unfortunately, this kind of is a thing I've noticed with Netflix projects. A lot of projects begin really strong and fall apart, and I've complained about that in previous videos. I didn't expect the fall apart to be Part 3. And you know what? I'm not even angry about this movie being bad. I'm just disappointed. Netflix, you can do better. The crew of this movie clearly could do better because the first 2 movies were great. And I hate to admit it, but if they announced, we're gonna do the Fear Street Saga trilogy next, or we're gonna do the Cheerleaders trilogy next, or we're gonna do 99 Fear Street next, or we're gonna make an anthology series next, I'd be down. If it isn't obvious, I don't recommend this movie. But if you've already seen Part 1 and 2, you may as well watch Part 3 and finish the story. If you haven't seen any of these movies, give the first 2 a watch. You'll probably have an enjoyable time, and then just kind of grit your teeth and get through Part 3 just to conclude the story. I don't know if I'll be revisiting this Fear Street trilogy again, but I am glad that it brought into my interest in the world of Shadyside and the worlds of R.L. Stine. I don't think I'm ever going to read any of the books, but I am glad to know more about this world, and I think that R.L. Stine really hit something special when he created this teen slasher anthology series. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the trilogy and of Part 3. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And why? Until next time, I will be getting a new, fun Summerween review that hopefully will not force me to do 3 movies in a row. And I hope you're having a wonderful Summerween as well. Until next time, I'll see you at the tavern.